I'd given 10 years of my life to that company. Late nights, missed birthdays, canceled vacations. When servers went down at 3 in the morning, I was the one who logged in, fixed it, kept the wheels turning. And after all of that, they sat me down in a glass office, looked me straight in the eye, and said the words that stripped away a decade of loyalty in one breath. You'll work for 58% less, or you're out. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't even flinch. I nodded once, stood up, and walked out of that office with the same calm face I'd walked in with. Inside, something colder than anger had settled, a silence that sharpened into steel. My name is Michael Grant, 47 years old, senior systems analyst at Halverson Dynamics, until that Monday morning. For a decade, I'd been their safety net, the quiet guy who never complained, who fixed problems before anyone noticed they existed. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't political. But I was indispensable, even if they had forgotten it. The meeting had been staged. HR was already there, papers printed, numbers highlighted. They wanted me cornered, desperate enough to accept scraps just to keep my seat. The young VP tried to soften it with corporate language. Restructuring, realignment, market corrections. Empty words. What he really meant was, we found a cheaper way to use you, and if you don't like it, get out. I left without a scene. No raised voice. No slammed doors. But in my head, I opened a notebook and wrote 3 words: freeze. Track. Respond. It was how we handled breaches in the system, and it was how I'd handle this. On the elevator ride down, I thought of Andrea, my wife of 22 years, who'd always believed the company valued me. I thought of Olivia, our daughter, finishing her 2nd year of college, tuition bills stacked on my desk at home. I thought of every time I'd told them the sacrifices were worth it because stability mattered more than anything else. By the time I stepped into the parking lot, stability was gone. But I wasn't. I drove home in silence, passing the same streets I'd passed every weekday morning. Except this time, there was no return trip waiting for me. Andrea met me at the door, reading my face before I said a word. She asked what happened. I told her the truth, plain and stripped of details. They cut my salary almost in half. She waited for me to rage, to collapse, to swear. But I only said, understood. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office, the glow of my laptop painting shadows across the room. I plugged in an old flash drive, one I'd kept locked away for years, and began reviewing files I'd quietly archived. Financial records, internal emails, access logs. Things most employees never saw. Things most executives forgot I had clearance to collect. It wasn't revenge I was after. It was clarity. Proof. The quiet man in the corner sees everything because no one bothers to look his way. And if they thought I was going to accept half a paycheck after holding their empire together for a decade, they were about to learn what silence can really do. I spent the next morning in silence. Andrea left for work. Olivia texted me about her classes, and I sat alone in the house that my paycheck had built, staring at the files I'd pulled up the night before. Every click of the mouse felt like loading a weapon, except mine wasn't steel and powder, it was information. For years, I'd been the one asked to run quiet audits. When executives wanted to make sure nobody was stealing or cutting corners, they came to me. And I did it well. Too well. I'd built systems that tracked everything: logins, transactions, file transfers. The kind of digital footprints that never truly disappear. The executives had forgotten about that. I hadn't. I opened a folder labeled Archive_2019. Buried inside were logs that showed something unusual. Payments to a vendor I'd never heard of, Apex Strategies, filed under software consulting. The amounts weren't enormous at first, but they grew steadily. 10,000 here, 25,000 there. Always approved by the same chain of signatures. I leaned back, the pieces sliding into place. They hadn't cut my pay because of market conditions. They'd cut me out because I was too close to seeing what they were hiding. Andrea came home late that night. She asked if I'd applied for new jobs. I told her no. She pressed, worried about the bills, about Olivia's tuition. I told her I was working on it. She didn't need to know the details yet. Not until I had something solid. By midnight, I had filled 2 legal pads with notes. Dates, transaction IDs, user accounts tied to approvals. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. I didn't need to expose it yet. Not to the company, not to the press. First, I had to know exactly how deep it went. The next day, I called an old friend, Robert Hayes. Years ago, he'd been the company's legal counsel before retiring. I trusted him because he'd trusted me once, when I'd run audits for him that never saw the light of day. I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed advice on irregularities. His answer was simple: document everything, keep backups off-site, and don't tip your hand until you're certain. I followed his advice to the letter. I bought an encrypted drive, copied everything twice, and locked one copy in a safe deposit box at the bank. The other stayed with me. That evening, while Andrea cooked dinner, I scrolled through a year's worth of internal emails. Phrases kept repeating: streamlining expenses, restructuring incentives, vendor consolidation. Corporate camouflage. But hidden between the lines were signatures that tied directly to our CFO and, sometimes, to Daniel, the VP who delivered my pay cut like it was nothing. I didn't say a word. I didn't storm into anyone's office. I just kept collecting, one file at a time. Because if they thought firing me cheap or cutting my salary would silence me, they'd made the gravest mistake of their careers. By the third day, my silence had already begun to work. Daniel, the VP, called twice and left messages I didn't return. His tone was smooth on the surface, but edged with urgency. He said he hoped I was considering the offer, and that the company still valued my contributions. In translation, it meant he was nervous. Nervous men make mistakes. I stayed quiet. Instead of answering, I logged into systems they hadn't revoked me from yet. Their IT department had been sloppy. They assumed cutting my salary would make me vanish quietly. But my old credentials still unlocked doors most people didn't even know existed. I traced Apex strategies further. The address listed on invoices didn't lead to a real office. It led to a rented mailbox inside a UPS store. A shell company. That meant someone inside Halverson Dynamics was funneling money out, dressing it up as legitimate contracts. And every dollar was approved by our CFO, Brian Keller. I wrote his name 3 times in my notebook, underlined it, then circled it. Daniel was the messenger. Brian was the architect. That evening, Andrea asked again if I was okay. She said I was too quiet, that I hadn't eaten much. I told her I was focused on something important. She didn't push. 22 years of marriage teaches you when not to push. I thought of Olivia again, her tuition, her dreams, her faith in me. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everything they thought they could take from me without consequence. On Friday morning, I drafted a short email. Just a few lines. No accusations, no threats. Only a subject line: financial irregularities, urgent. And inside, a single line: Brian, I believe there are issues with vendor payments that require immediate attention. I didn't sign it with my name. I sent it from an untraceable account that looked internal but wasn't. 30 minutes later, Daniel called again. This time his voice was tighter. He said he'd heard concerning rumors and hoped I wasn't involved in spreading them. I didn't reply. I simply noted the time of his call in my logbook. That afternoon, I went to the bank, opened my safe deposit box, and added a fresh set of files. If they tried to bury me, those files would surface in places they couldn't control. I didn't rage. I didn't demand answers. I just kept moving, step by quiet step, because pressure works best when it builds slowly, like water pressing against a dam. And I could already see the cracks forming. By Monday morning, I knew the silence was working. News travels fast in corporate corridors, and when people don't know what you know, imagination does the rest. My phone buzzed with another voicemail from Daniel. His tone had shifted again. He spoke about opportunities to revisit the terms and suggested we could find a middle ground. Translation: the ground beneath him was cracking. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned my attention to Brian Keller, the CFO. His signature was on every inflated payment to Apex Strategies. I studied the approval timestamps. Most of them were filed after office hours, late at night, when fewer eyes were watching. That was the mistake. Real contracts don't need to hide in the shadows. I copied the approval logs into a clean report, one that could be understood even by someone outside the IT world. No jargon, just names, dates, amounts, and the company's money flowing into a black hole. It was damning in its simplicity. That afternoon, I walked past the Halverson Dynamics building. I hadn't been back since the day they cut my pay. Through the glass walls, I could see Daniel pacing his office. He looked smaller now, agitated. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Then I remembered the look in his eyes when he told me I was worth 58% less. Pity vanished. Andrea asked again that evening if I'd found new work. I told her I was close. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. She deserved to know, but telling her now would only put her in the blast radius. Better to keep her outside the fire until the outcome was certain. I spent the night setting up something I'd been saving for years, an automated release system. If anything happened to me, if my laptop went offline for more than 48 hours, every file I collected would be emailed to board members, auditors, and 2 journalists I trusted. Insurance. Quiet leverage. The next morning, Brian himself called. His voice was smoother than Daniel's, rehearsed, like a man who'd practiced deception for years. He said he'd heard concerns about financial matters and suggested a private meeting to clear up misunderstandings. I listened without speaking, then hung up without a word. His mask cracked in that silence more than it would have under any accusation. By Wednesday, HR sent an official email offering me a revised package. Double the severance, confidentiality clauses, non-disclosure agreements. They thought money would buy my silence. But money wasn't the point anymore. Respect was. And as I stared at that email, I realized the pressure was building exactly as planned. They were bending. Soon, they would break. Thursday morning, I decided it was time to move from watching to acting. Not a loud move, not a confrontation, just a small ripple in still water, enough to test how fast the panic would spread. I composed an email from the same untraceable account I'd used before. This one went directly to the board of directors. It contained no accusations, no dramatic claims. Only a short excerpt of the report I'd built. 3 payments to Apex Strategies, amounts totaling $72,000, and Brian Keller's approval signature on each. The subject line was simple. Potential irregularities. Recommend immediate review. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. By noon, the effect was visible. Daniel called 3 times, each message sharper than the last. He said rumors were reaching the board, that someone was trying to damage the company, and that I needed to cooperate for everyone's sake. His voice cracked when he said it. That was new. I ignored him. Instead, I went for a walk through the downtown district. From the sidewalk, I watched employees rushing in and out of the building, their faces tense. Word was spreading, and while they scrambled, I stayed calm. The quietest man in the story always holds the loudest cards. That evening, Andrea mentioned she'd noticed me calmer than before. She thought maybe I'd accepted the company's decision. I only nodded. In a way, I had accepted it. But acceptance doesn't mean surrender. It means adjusting the plan until it fits reality. Back home, I pulled out the second copy of my files and began expanding the report. This time I included names of secondary sign-offs, junior managers who had approved the payments without realizing what they were attached to. They were pawns, but pawns leave trails. And every trail pointed back to Keller. Friday morning, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Daniel or Brian. It was Patricia, the company's general counsel. Her tone was clipped, professional. She asked if I had knowledge of documents currently circulating. I stayed silent, letting her fill the silence with nervous explanations about misunderstandings. When she paused, I simply ended the call. The pressure was rising now, not just on Keller and Daniel, but across the executive floor. They had lived in comfort for too long, believing they were untouchable. But numbers don't lie, and I had the numbers. That night, I set a timer on my system. At exactly 9 a.m. Monday, the board would receive another package of files, unless I stopped it. I didn't plan to stop it. The game was no longer about survival. It was about control. And for the first time in a decade, I was the one holding it. By Monday morning, the silence was deafening. I hadn't answered a single call over the weekend. I hadn't replied to HR's emails. I hadn't acknowledged the generous severance package sitting in my inbox. Instead, I let the timer run. At exactly 9 a.m., the board of directors received the second wave of files. Clean, simple, undeniable. The call started almost immediately. Patricia, the general counsel, left a message saying the board had serious concerns and that it was critical I come in to clarify. She sounded less like an attorney and more like someone watching the walls collapse. I didn't go in. I didn't return the calls. I drove to a small diner on the edge of town, ordered black coffee, and watched the minutes pass. While the executives panicked behind glass walls, I sat in peace. knowing every move was unfolding exactly as I intended. Around noon, my old protege, Alex, texted me. He didn't know the details, but he said emergency meetings had been called upstairs and Keller looked like he'd seen a ghost. He added one line at the end. They underestimated you. That evening, I logged into the system again. Somehow, my credentials still worked. Sloppy oversight from the same people who thought cutting my pay would erase me. I found frantic email threads between Keller, Daniel, and Patricia. Words like containment, liability, and board escalation filled the subject lines. They were bleeding internally, scrambling to keep the damage from spreading. Andrea noticed me reading at my desk late into the night. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine, that I was close to finishing something important. She didn't press. She trusted me, even if she didn't know the whole story. The next morning, I left a single envelope at the doorstep of the board chairman's house. No return address, no signature. Inside was the full report, every transaction, every falsified vendor payment, every approval signed by Keller. Alongside it, I included one final line. Check the mailbox address for Apex Strategies. By afternoon, Keller tried to call me himself. His voice was strained, brittle. He said we could work this out, that mistakes had been made, but nothing irreversible. I didn't answer. I let his words die in the voicemail box, another record of his desperation. That night, I sat by the window of my home office, lights off, watching the street outside. For the first time in years, I felt something close to control. They thought silence meant weakness, but silence was the weapon they'd never learned to defend against. And I wasn't finished yet. By Wednesday, the cracks were no longer hidden. Local business news sites reported internal investigations at Halverson Dynamics. No names were mentioned yet, but I didn't need confirmation. I knew exactly who was sitting in those closed-door meetings, sweating under the fluorescent lights while the board dissected every file I'd handed them. Alex texted me again. He said Daniel hadn't shown up for 2 days. Keller looked pale, drained, like a man watching the noose tighten around his neck. HR sent out vague memos about restructuring, but everyone in the office knew something bigger was happening. Fear spreads faster than truth. I kept silent. No interviews. No calls. Not even a single message back to Alex. The less I said, the louder the pressure grew. That afternoon, Andrea mentioned she'd heard rumors through a friend whose husband worked downtown. She said people were whispering about financial fraud. She asked me if I had anything to do with it. I told her only this. Sometimes the truth takes time to surface. It was enough. She let it rest. That evening, I sat with my files spread across the desk, reviewing everything again. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. If Keller tried to twist the story, if Daniel tried to claim ignorance, I wanted every angle covered. Dates matched approvals. Approvals matched transactions. Transactions led directly to Apex Strategies. And Apex Strategies led to a rented mailbox in Keller's neighborhood. The next morning, I received a voicemail from Patricia, the general counsel. Her tone was icy now, professional but fraying at the edges. She said the board had suspended certain individuals, pending investigation. She urged me to engage constructively before outside authorities became involved. In other words, the board had already begun turning inward, sacrificing their own to protect the structure. I didn't return her call. Instead, I opened my laptop and scheduled one final release. Every document, every log, every piece of evidence, set to go out to 3 national business outlets if my system wasn't reset within 72 hours. Insurance, again. Quiet leverage. By Friday, Keller's name appeared in the news. The article mentioned executive leave and pending review. Corporate code for a man already sinking. Daniel's name wasn't mentioned, but Alex said he'd cleared out his office overnight. Disappeared. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back in the darkened kitchen, and listened to the silence of my own house. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight shift. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. They thought silence meant surrender. But now, my silence was the one thing they couldn't contain. The following week began with headlines. Bigger outlets had picked up the story now. Halverson Dynamics CFO under investigation for fraudulent contracts. The article was brief, careful with its language, but it carried the weight of exposure. Keller's photo was plastered online, his name tied to numbers that didn't add up. For a man who lived by prestige, that was already a death sentence. Andrea read the article aloud at breakfast, then looked at me. She didn't ask if I was involved. She didn't need to. After 22 years of marriage, silence can speak louder than words. She only said, "I hope you're being careful." I told her I was. That afternoon, I drove past the headquarters again. This time, reporters stood outside, cameras trained on the glass doors. Employees walked quickly, heads down, avoiding questions. Through the glass, I saw the security team escort Keller out. No jacket, no briefcase. Just a man walking away from the empire he thought he controlled. Daniel's name surfaced next. Internal memo leaked. He was terminated effective immediately. No severance, no statements. He'd been cut off like a limb infected too long. Patricia left another voicemail that evening. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the strain underneath. She said the board was grateful for anonymous cooperation, and that further disclosures were unnecessary, since federal authorities had already been contacted. She urged whoever was behind the leaks to step back. That was her way of begging. I didn't step back. I let the 72-hour timer on my system keep running. I wanted them to know that silence wasn't retreat, it was control. Meanwhile, Alex kept me updated in short texts. He said the office felt like a ghost town, people whispering in hallways, wondering how much had been stolen and who else had known. Some thought Keller acted alone. Others suspected the rot went deeper. Either way, they all knew someone had forced the truth into daylight. One night, Andrea found me sitting in the dark office again. She asked if this was worth it. I told her it wasn't about worth anymore. It was about consequence. For too long, they believed loyalty was a resource to exploit. Now they were learning loyalty, once betrayed, becomes something sharper. By Friday, Keller's resignation was official. The company released a polished statement about personal reasons and new leadership. But everyone knew. Behind the polished words, the empire was bleeding. And I hadn't raised my voice once. The Monday after Keller's resignation, a letter arrived by courier. Heavy paper, embossed seal of Halverson Dynamics. No return address, but I didn't need one. Inside was an invitation. The board wanted to meet with me. Not as an employee, not as a suspect. As someone they now called an independent advisor. The irony wasn't lost on me. A week ago, I was worth 58% less in their eyes. Now they wanted me at the table they'd once barred me from. Andrea read the letter quietly, then set it down. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I hadn't decided. Because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about principle. About whether silence could be broken without losing its edge. I went to the meeting anyway, not to accept their offer, but to measure their desperation. The boardroom felt colder than I remembered. 10 executives sat around a polished table, all trying not to look nervous. Robert Chun, one of the older directors, did most of the talking. He said the company was grateful for whoever helped bring the truth forward. He said they needed someone to rebuild the integrity of their systems. He said that person should be me. I stayed quiet. Let the words hang in the air. Let them feel the weight of their own need. Finally, Robert asked if I had any conditions. I pulled a folder from my jacket and slid it across the table. Inside were 3 pages, typed cleanly. Independent oversight authority, full audit access across departments, and protection from termination without board approval. My price wasn't money. It was autonomy. They read it in silence. Some frowned. Some whispered. But Robert nodded slowly. He said they would consider it carefully. I stood, thanked them once, and left. On the drive home, I thought about the offer. I could walk back into that building with more power than I'd ever imagined. Or I could walk away forever, leaving them to choke on the silence I'd planted. That night, Andrea asked me again if I'd go back. I told her the truth. I'm not sure yet. Because power is tempting. But sometimes the real victory is refusing to play their game at all. As I sat alone in the dark, one thought kept circling my mind. They'd taken 10 years from me. 10 years of loyalty, stolen without apology. Now, for the first time, the choice was mine. And I intended to make it quietly. The board called again 3 days later. Their tone had changed. The hesitation was gone. They agreed to every condition in the folder. Full authority, direct oversight, immunity from termination without cause. They wanted me back, not as a worker they could underpay, but as a guardian of the empire they nearly lost. I listened in silence, then told them I would think about it. I ended the call without giving an answer. For hours, I sat in my office, the offer hanging in the air like a loaded weapon. Andrea came in quietly, placed a cup of coffee on the desk, and asked if I was going to take it. I told her the truth. I don't know. Because on one hand, the role would give me power they never imagined I could hold. On the other, returning would tie me once more to a place that had treated me like I was disposable. That night, I opened the files one last time. Every transaction, every log, every piece of proof. They were no longer weapons. I had already used them. Now they were reminders. Proof not of what they did, but of what silence can achieve when it's sharpened into steel. The next morning, I drove past the headquarters. Reporters were gone. Employees were back at their desks. The building looked the same as it always had. But I knew better. It wasn't the same. They weren't the same. And neither was I. I parked across the street, watching for a long time. I thought about the years I'd given them. The birthdays missed, the nights spent staring at code instead of my daughter's face. The sacrifices they'd cashed in without a second thought. And I realized the truth. No position, no title, no authority could buy back what they'd taken. So I drove away. I didn't go inside. I didn't take the job. I didn't call the board back. I let the silence be my final answer. A week later, I received another letter. This one was short. We respect your decision. Thank you for protecting what we almost lost. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't respect, not really. But it was acknowledgement. And for me, that was enough. Now, when people ask what happened, I don't explain. I don't tell them about Keller or Daniel or Apex strategies. I just say this. Some lessons are learned quietly. Because in the end, I hadn't won by shouting louder than them. I won by refusing to play their game at all. And their regret arrived exactly the way I planned, quietly. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.